This conference will now be recorded.
Good evening, folks, and welcome. Rick here from Queen's College, and delighted today to be doing part 2 in our series on Living the Fifth with Reverend Mark Nichols. I introduced him last time, but delighted, Mark, that you're setting aside the time to both prepare and present these sessions. Blessings on you. I'll pass it to you, Mark.
All right, thank you very much, Rick. I didn't begin last week with a prayer, but I think I'll do that this week, and I'm going to use one of the prayers that Pope Francis has in his encyclical Laudato Si. So let us pray. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain, at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Amen.
So last session, I spoke to how the broader church has over time come to discern a clear calling for care, to care for creation as an integral aspect of the Christian faith. So in this session, I want us to look at how that calling can be lived out by faith communities. Next session, I'll talk about us as individuals, but this week or this session, I want to talk about faith communities. So how can faith communities live out the church's call to care for creation? And I use the term faith communities rather than parish communities because, as many of you know, parishes often consist of more than one community. And I don't want to use the term congregation to reflect this reality, as many single-point parishes have more than one worshiping congregation. So if I inadvertently use the term parish community today, know that I mean faith community, a community that gathers together in a particular place. And I firmly believe that the faith community is the front line of ministry, the boots on the ground. So how the church is encountered, experienced, and perceived, for better or for worse, lies in how the local faith community lives out the gospel. And I believe that the faith community, any particular faith community, should be a beacon of light within the broader community that they serve. But sadly, this is not always the case. Far too often, we're focused on things that nobody out there is focused on. We argue about things that nobody out there really cares about. So I think living the fifth of the 5 marks of mission provides faith communities a powerful opportunity to shine as beacons of light within the broader community, because creation care matters to folks outside the church. I can tell you that for a fact. They wouldn't use that term. They would probably talk about, environmentalism or ecological care or whatever, but trust me, creation care matters to folks outside the church. But we can't just put on the creation care mantle to be popular with folks outside the church. The desire to safeguard the integrity of creation, the desire to sustain and renew the life of the earth, has to be a sincerely and deeply held value of a faith community before they can ever shine as a light in the broader community. And we have to live out that value in our communal life. No one out there really wants to hear what we believe. They want to see it, and they want to see it lived out. So I don't think I can stress this point enough. We can't just dress ourselves up as people who care about the environment. It has to really be, this integral part of our DNA as a faith community. That's what people will see. That's what people will be drawn to. That's what people will trust. And sadly, in my humble opinion, creation care, I firmly believe that creation care is the least lived out of the 5 marks of mission on a communal level. Maybe not on a personal level, but certainly as faith communities. It's the least lived out of the 5 marks of mission. And as I mentioned last session, the church is calling faith communities to change that. So how can we go about this? Well, climate scientist Dr. Katherine Hayhoe, who happens to be an evangelical Christian, when she speaks about the existential crisis of climate change, she says that the number one thing we can do is the exact thing that we're not doing, and that is talk about it. And I believe that her words are appropriate to creation care in general. We need to talk about it in our faith communities at every possible opportunity. So I would say, is creation care a frequent theme in the sermons that are preached in your faith community? Is creation care a focus of Bible studies? Is it a focus of Sunday school lessons and the prayers of the people? Does your faith community observe the season of creation liturgically? Because if we're not talking about creation care within our faith communities on a regular basis, if we're not talking about the threat posed by the ecological crisis before us, I'm not really sure how it would become a sincerely and deeply held value. So I would give an example. There was 10 parishes, I think, total, who joined me in seeking signatures on a petition for the House of Assembly to declare a climate emergency. Some of you might be members of those 10 parishes. But the 2 parishes that have collected the most signatures by far are the 2 parishes where I know for a fact that creation care is talked about all the time in different ways. And so it's on people's minds more because it's talked about so much more, and therefore more people would respond to something like signing a petition to declare a climate emergency. So I think we need to be talking about creation care often. It's 1/5 of the marks of mission. So I think it should at least get 1/5 of our attention as faith communities. Again, that's a really big step if it's going to become a sincerely and deeply held value of a faith community. Now, I think the second most important thing we can do as faith communities is to educate ourselves about the ecological crisis. Right? Through education, minds can be changed. People may not see something as a problem, but when they're presented with evidence that shows it is a problem, they will change their minds. Most of us are rational beings. So only then, after we educate ourselves about the ecological crisis, will we come to grips with the magnitude of the harm that's being done to this fragile earth by the worst excesses of human beings' behavior. So only then will we understand what's at stake and how far short we've fallen from our divine commission to be stewards of creation. So our minds must be changed, as Mr. Shaw says, but so too must our hearts be changed. So how can we go about this? I know that I've been writing now for well over a year and a half on creation care issues in Anglican life. Some may have been reading those columns and some may not have, but that's been there, very available to people in Anglican life. And I've also set up a Living the Fifth Facebook page that anybody who's on Facebook can go and like the page, and then they will see what I post on there. And I'm trying to focus that page on things that will educate us as to the ecological crisis. In fact, these sessions that I'm doing through Queens are also being posted to that Facebook page, Living the Fifth, so people who weren't able to watch this live would be able to watch it there as well. So that's a couple of things that I'm doing to make that, to help educate people, help open people's minds to the magnitude of the crisis. And there's also books that people can read. There's a couple that I would recommend. One is The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. And another one would be The Carbon Code, which I think I have right here. The Carbon Code by Brett Favreau. Brett is a scientist who's here working at the Marine Institute in St. John's for a little while longer anyway, and that's a very accessible book too for people to educate themselves about the climate crisis and the ecological crisis as a whole. So education. The first step again is to be talking about it a lot on a regular basis, and the second thing is education, getting ourselves the information so we can understand the magnitude of the crisis. So as creation care animator, there's many aspects of the ecological crisis, but I'm going to focus, people will notice over time, I'm going to kind of focus on two aspects of the crisis. And the first of that is the waste crisis. Because we humans, especially in affluent countries like Canada, we produce a lot of waste. In 2018, so very recently, Canadians produced roughly 850 kilograms of municipal waste per person. 850 kilograms of municipal waste per person, and that's in the entire year. So when you think about that, that is a lot of waste that we create. And I think faith communities in particular produce a lot of waste, both in plastics, especially single-use plastics, and organic waste. So if we look at the plastic side of it, global plastics production is getting close to 500 million tons a year, and 40% of that is packaging. 40% of close to 500 million tons a year is just packaging. So roughly 50% of the plastic produced around the world every year is disposed of after a single use. So we're talking a lot of plastic going into the waste stream after one use. Now, much of this plastic winds up in our soil, our lakes, rivers, and oceans, making its way into the food chain to the point that we now unknowingly ingest plastics on a daily basis. There's some estimates that each of us consumes the equivalent of a credit card worth of plastic in a week. I haven't really been able to research that to see if there's studies behind that, but we do know that whenever they test stool samples, for example, they can always find microplastics or nanoplastics within human beings' stool samples. So we're ingesting it, whether we know it or not. And the other thing about plastics, or plastic waste and everything, is the production of plastics. That the most common plastics involve fossil fuels, right? They're really petroplastics, and this plays into the climate crisis, which I'm going to get into in a moment. So I think one thing the faith communities, if they're taking this seriously, if this is a deeply held value, one of the things that we need to confront as faith communities is our excessive use of single-use plastics. So, on one level, simply living by the 3 R's would go a long way in living out care for creation, as long as we recognize that these 3 R's are not equal, right? These 3 R's represent a hierarchy. So the first one is reduce. And reduce means not creating the plastic waste in the first place, right? Like whenever there's an option, we should not be creating plastic waste. So for example, if a faith community is really taking this seriously, if this is a deeply held core value of that congregation, that parish, what have you, then I wouldn't see bottled water. I wouldn't see that ever. I wouldn't see bottled soda. I wouldn't see single-use plastic bags, shopping bags, and I wouldn't see disposable plates, cutlery, food containers, or disposable coffee cups from that company that shall remain nameless. But I see all of these things when I go into different parishes, including my own. It's a hard battle to fight against that stuff. Now, I am aware of faith communities that are taking a proactive step on this and trying to eliminate all of these things from parish life or from their communal life, which is good. But we need to do a lot more work on reducing the single-use plastics that we use. And then reuse is number 2. So when it is unavoidable that we use plastic containers, for example, we should find another use for them. Try to keep them in use and delay them hitting into the waste stream. And then third is recycle. And recycling should really be understood as the least worst option. It is not a desirable option, but it's the least worst option, and is used as a last resort when there is no way to reduce or reuse. Because with recycling, there's limitations. For example, just because a piece of plastic has the symbol on it that says it's recyclable doesn't mean that it is recycled by your municipal recycling program. They will only take stuff that they can find a market for. Because if they can't find a market for it, it just goes into landfill. So this is, one of the things to remember. Just because the producer of that single-use plastic tells you it's recyclable does not mean it's going to get into the recycling system. And anybody who's been following the news about the black eye that Western countries have gotten since China stopped taking our plastic garbage, and other countries have been shipping it back to us, we have not been recycling these things in our own country. We produce it, and then we send it to developing nations for them to deal with. I won't even get into the moral horror of that, the lack of ethics in that. So keep in mind that just because we're putting it into a blue bin does not mean it's going to get recycled. And recycling, and then when we talk about recycling of plastics, we have to remember that plastics are not infinitely recyclable. They basically go down a level every time they're recycled. I think the maximum time that you can recycle plastics might be 7 times. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I know it's not that many. And that depends at what level your plastic is to begin with. If it's already low down, then it's not going to have much of a life left. So eventually, every bit of plastic that's made, if it's not being reused, then it winds up in the waste stream eventually. So that's something to keep in mind about the limitations of recycling when it comes to plastics. So just a little project I did in my own parish after I spent a lot of time talking about it. And while we did see a reduction in a number of types of plastics making their way in, it's so ingrained in our behavior that people still brought single-use plastics into the into the parish. And so I did some screening of the trash, looking at what was recyclable that was thrown in the trash. But I also found even our recycling containers, even though we have 3 separate containers for it to be sorted, I would still have to screen that because there were so many contaminants in it that if that went to the recycling program, it might just wind up, if it's too contaminated, it'll just go straight into the landfill, depending on where your municipal recycling program is. So, if we're taking it seriously, we're probably not only going to have recycling containers, we're going to have some sort of a screening of what's going in there. Then the other aspect of the waste that we create in parishes is organic waste. Now, organics, I think a recent study that was done for the province showed that about 30% of what goes into Newfoundland and Labrador landfills is organics, which in turn, as it decomposes, emits methane. And a modern dump will try to burn that methane, because methane is so much worse than regular carbon. It's much more powerful of a greenhouse gas. And so often a modern waste management system will burn the methane to convert it to a less harmful greenhouse gas, but it's a greenhouse gas nonetheless. And according to the provincial government, 8% of Newfoundland and Labrador's greenhouse gas emissions is from our landfills. So we need to do, all of us, individually, communally, we need to find ways to not have organic waste go to the landfills. And getting back to my original point, faith communities produce a lot of waste and a lot of organic waste. Just think about all the food scraps that get thrown out after we have like a parish meal or something like that, right? Or a community meal. So first and foremost, we should strive to produce as little organic waste as possible, and then what we do produce should be composted to the greatest degree possible. Whatever, we need to find innovative ways to keep the organic waste we produce out of landfill. Now, I'll give you the example of my wife and I. We live in a row house, so we have a very small backyard, and there's no way for us to have a compost bin in there in a way that we could efficiently compost the organic waste that we produce. And plus, even if you do have a backyard one, you're not going to put meat or meat bones in that, because that will attract insects and rats. So there's a company that serves the St. John's area that we pay $20 a month to, and they come and get our bucket every Thursday of organic waste. And that person then takes it to their farm, and they have a way of which they I guess, grind it up and compost it and use it on the farm. And this means that we are now the only organic waste that we would put into our municipal garbage is the kitty litter that we scoop, because he won't take that. But everything else organic, he takes. So we don't put any more organic waste in our garbage. And it means that between my wife and I, we put out less than a kitchen catcher a week. So now I'm not saying this company is going to come and take all your parish's organic waste, but I'm just saying it's possible that something like this could be set up. So this might be an idea for a parish as a parish project, or a faith community as a community project. Might be something that you partner with the municipality on, or whatever. But this offers us an opportunity to really shine as a beacon for the community. So some other ways that we might go about reducing waste, and we can, if anybody wants to come in with comments or whatever, I'm just going to say that I've already talked about municipal programs and their limitations. There's a company online out of the United States called TerraCycle. They take hard to recycle things and recycle them. I don't know, some of you might remember a story a couple of years ago on CBC. A couple of the CBC stations, I think Corner Brook and Happy Valley Goose Bay, were taking back Halloween candy wrappers. And they were collecting them and then sending them off to this company. They had to pay money to do that, but then that company would then recycle these candy wrappers. Island Composting is a company. That's the company that collects my residential compostables. There's an organization called Zero Waste NL. They would be of great help. They're on Facebook as well, just Zero Waste NL. And they, that's a community where people are sharing ideas. So faith communities might get some ideas from that. And I also have a note here about partnerships. This is a really good opportunity if a parish is going to take waste reduction or trying to move towards a zero waste parish, there are opportunities to partner with other organizations, other entities, to do that in a way that you're actually serving the broader community. So I guess really it's just how big you're willing to think. But it is something fundamental that we can do if this is a value of a faith community. I can just stop there for a minute if anybody wanted to jump in with something they're doing or something that they're thinking about, or a question that you have on what I've said so far. Okay, I'll move on then.
Sorry, I didn't have my mic on, Mark. I just wanted to ask, efforts that are made, such as the example you illustrated of the agency that collects the organic waste from your home. Do they advertise that much? I wasn't aware. Not that that means very much, but is there? Do they advertise it much and those types of things?
I don't think they're advertising a lot because I think he's probably pretty close to being at capacity. He's just dealing with household waste. So he, has a route, I guess, where he comes around, like he hits us on Thursday and collects it all, takes it back. And I'm just saying that if this, and this is just a small enterprise, right? It's a farmer and he uses the compost on his own farm. So I guess my point is, if this person is doing this, it's doable. Now, he's operating in the Metro St. John's area, and I'm thinking that some of the people who may be watching this live far, far away from the St. John's area. But if it's doable, if it's possible, if somebody's doing it in one place, it could be done in another place. So this is an opportunity for parish communities. If I was a parish community in a rural place, now maybe that's not a good example because in rural places people do tend to be able to compost very easily themselves. But I don't know if it's a built up place. Maybe there's an opportunity to offer, if you could set something up, offer it to the community as well, that people who don't have the time or the ability to compost could bring it on a certain day and the parish could be doing it. So I just think there's opportunities there.
Yeah, there's also the connection with community gardens as well, which is another aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be something that a parish could work with the broader community on, especially if you're doing it organically. And that would be something in the realm of creation care, because food security is certainly an issue in this province. And if you're, composting and using that in these gardens, then that's a good thing too. I'm just throwing ideas out here, but I don't have all the ideas. I mean, what works in my parish isn't going to work in your parish, and vice versa. But faith communities, if they want to take this seriously, they need to think about it.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next part. So I said the waste crisis, and then the other one is the climate crisis. All right. So by climate crisis, I mean anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change. So climate change refers to the warming of the planet by increasing amounts of greenhouse gases trapped in our atmosphere. We've always had greenhouse gases. That's part of how we don't freeze to death on this planet. There's always been gases trapped in there that keep the planet heated to a certain level. But the difference that's happening now is things are out of balance. And since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning fossil fuels. And so if you look at those stripes, the climate stripes that are on the screen now, the slide, there's a guy down in the States who does these for different jurisdictions. And so this is the climate stripes for Canada. The very, very first stripe, which is at the left end of your screen, is 1901, and the furthest to the right is 2018. So you can see that there's always, warming and cooling and stuff like that, but something very different has been happening for the last number of years. And so that's showing you how fast the planet is warming up. And these greenhouse gases, they come primarily, overwhelmingly, from the burning of fossil fuels. So oil, coal, oil, and fossil gas or natural gas. And then the other cause of it really is the deforestation that we've undergone on the planet for agriculture and urbanization. So, the forests that we have take, carbon out of the air and produce oxygen for us. But as we've deforested the planet so much, so the planet's ability to deal with the greenhouse gases that we're putting out there is being taken away. And so that also contributes to the buildup of greenhouse gases around the planet. I'm not going into the science of this today. That's a subject for another time with somebody much more knowledgeable than me. I did on Living the Fifth post a talk we had by Dr. Brett Favreau, the one who wrote the Carbon Code, and he gave an overview of the climate crisis. So if you have the time to watch that video, that presentation, I think you'll have a better idea of the science of it and the impact that it's having on our planet. So there is an overwhelming scientific consensus that in order to limit the effects of climate change to manageable levels, we must limit global temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, and if at all possible, to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what they mean by that is that's the most it can rise from pre-industrial levels, from before the Industrial Revolution. But we're already at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. So we're already at 1.1 degrees. So the window to keep it at 1.5 degrees warming is rapidly closing in. And the difference between even 1.5 degrees and the difference between 2 degrees is huge on the consequences. So this year, we've all been seeing in the news and everything different consequences of a changing climate on the earth. Well, it's only going to get worse. It's never going to be as good as it is today. It's going to keep on getting worse. We've locked in a certain amount of warming. It's locked in now, even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases today. The question is, when are we going to stop emitting those? When are we going to get to a point where we're no longer emitting those into the atmosphere? And then whatever temperature rise happens, that's where it will stay. Right? And so whether my grandchildren have a livable planet when they're my age really depends on what we do in the next 10 years. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that. Sorry, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That's what the science is telling us. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Just to give, like the brokenness of human behavior, this whole idea of climate change caused by human emissions of greenhouse gases first hit the public realm back in 1988. That's when it was first kind of talked about in a broader venue, not just a tight group of scientists. So that was 1988. 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came into being. It was a couple of years before the countries ratified it, but that came into being in 1992. So if you ever look up that document, you can go read it for yourself. It talks about the countries that were signatories to this recognize that we were at that time pretty darn sure we were causing this increase in temperatures. And then because the science then focused on it after that, by the time the year 2000 rolls around, there's an overwhelming consensus amongst the scientific community that yes, indeed, our emissions are causing it. So 1992, the world admitted that this was a problem. And our half of the emissions we've emitted since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution have been since 1992. So not only did we not address the emissions, we doubled down. So if you're looking for, an example of human brokenness, collective human sin, there you go. So more recently, Canada signed on to the Paris Agreement, which is considered to be, that was in 2015, and that was considered to be the most comprehensive climate agreement that we've ever had in the world. And Canada committed to a 30% reduction by 2030 from our 2005 emission levels. So that commitment that Canada made and that, Canada is working on would keep us below 2 degrees. If the rest of the world did the same thing, would keep us below 2 degrees. Now, if we're going for the 1.5 degree target, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the United Nations science organization that advises all the annual climate talks, they call for a 45% reduction of our 2010 levels by 2030. So whichever one you're going by, Canada is going by the 30% from 2005, 30% reduction. So we're not on target for that. I'm not sure any country that signed on to the Paris Agreement is actually on target for their emissions. Again, the brokenness of human beings. So that's just to lay out what the crisis is for you, right? When Greta Thunberg marches, and kids around the world are striking from school on Fridays for climate, and everybody's just calling them truants and everything like that. And then, Greta speaks to world leaders and says, that you have done nothing. She's right. We have not ever had our global emissions go down. And the only thing I can say for Canada is our emissions are leveling out in more recent years, in the past few years, but we still have not started a decline in emissions. 1992, we said this was a problem, and we're still increasing our emissions. So this is a crisis. What we're doing to our children and our grandchildren's generation is, in my mind, inexcusable. So if you want to look at Newfoundland and Labrador's greenhouse gas emissions, now this is from 2005, and it's broken down by sector. You can see that 11% of our emissions in this province are from buildings. So this is one thing that a faith community could look at if they're looking for ways in which they can take action on the climate crisis. They could look at reducing the emissions of our church buildings. Now, admittedly, there are some financial realities for most faith communities. We're limited by finances on what we could do. I don't think there's too many parishes around that could throw in geothermal heat pumps to heat our church and not cause any greenhouse gases. But I would ask, is there a possibility to switch to a greener means of heating our buildings? Like maybe there are parishes for which I don't know, they could switch to solar panels or whatever. I don't know everybody's situation. I'm just saying there's other alternatives to heat our buildings. Moving, once we're on lower Churchill power, to move to electricity from oil. I know everybody's worried about the rates, but that's another thing that would green your building. But surely, even financial things aside, every faith community could take some simple steps to improving energy efficiency within their church buildings, like LED light bulbs, timer switches, upgrading insulation, furnace or heater maintenance, turning off lights and computer equipment. There's still things that we could do, I think, in any church building. So that's something for people to look at. And then also, if you look at that breakdown there, you'll see that 22% of our emissions comes from transportation. Roughly half of that, I think it's about half of that, just over half of that, actually, around 12%, is from our personal vehicles. So, as unpopular as this will make me with a lot of people, maybe one thing we can do as parish communities, faith communities, is look at what's in our parking lot and talk about what's in our parking lot. I've had services where there's 30 people in the pews and there's 30 cars out in the parking lot. Um, different parishes, like I guess it depends on where we're located and on that. But if you're a neighborhood parish where most of your parish community lives relatively close, are we encouraging walking to church when the weather is suitable, or cycling to church? Do we have bike racks in our parking lot, which says we're encouraging you? Nothing says we're encouraging you to ride a bike like having a bike rack. I know that when the weather, pretty well all year round, even when the weather's bad, I walk to my parish. It's about 12 minutes away. So I usually walk there and back just because it's very easy for me to do. I don't need to drive there. So I think there are some things we could do to show some leadership. And now if I get back to my thinking big kind of thing, what about the potential of charging stations at church buildings in rural communities? The government right now is on a plan to put level 3 charging stations, across the province on the highway. But what about tourists who come in with electric vehicles that might want to shoot off into this small community? Where could they recharge their vehicle there? So there might be like an opportunity. I know there's some grant money from the feds. I don't know if that's still available, but there was last year, that maybe parishes could look at something like that. Sooner or later, you're going to start seeing electric vehicles in your parking lots on Sunday morning. So it is something to think about. Bike racks and how ready we are for people who drive electric cars. So those are just some of the things that we can do as faith communities. Just being mindful of the time here. There's I've got the website up there, operationnoah.org. There's other ones, but this one I kind of liked. It's from England. It's not tied to a particular church, like a particular denomination or whatever, but they have a resource called How Green is Your Parish? So if you want to look it up, they've got kind of like a checklist for things that you can think about. Maybe a lot of them don't apply to you, or maybe some of them you're already doing, but it has a checklist kind of for parishes just getting started in this, parishes that have been at it for a little while, and then parishes that are more advanced. So there are some resources out there, and I know the Anglican Communion has an environmental network, and there might be some resources there. But I guess why I don't really push a lot of this stuff is none of these resources seem geared specifically to your faith community. So you yourselves within your faith community really need to look at the practices of your community, and what kinds of things you could do within your faith community and within your broader community. I'd be glad to chat with people, one-on-one if they wanted to contact me to have more of a discussion about that. But I think, if we put our heads together, there's some good ideas. I already know a couple of parishes that are taking on various projects or looking at various projects. I think that for those faith communities are really going to have them shine as a beacon of light within their community. People in that community are going to know that, yes, this faith community really cares about the environment, and it would just put you in a better light within the community. Not to mention the fact that you would actually be living out one of our baptismal vows and the 5th mark of mission. So sorry I can't do more specific things because I don't know your situations, but that's just kind of like a broad strokes overview of ways in which we can become beacons of light when it comes to creation care in our broader communities. So I'll just open it now if there's any questions or comments, concerns?
Very interesting, Mark. Thank you very much for the insights and practical things as well. You know, we know that there are initiatives taken and the efforts around moving to new technologies, both in cars and for heating and what have you. But sometimes it's getting the right fit and the infrastructure around it. Last week I was visiting at a church, and they had put in two heating pumps or mini split type systems. And but what they found after the fact and after the expenditure is that they, I guess, hadn't done adequate research, or they'd been ill advised, and the units were inadequate to accomplish what they needed. So now they are money out on it. And unfortunately, these things happen because the word of that spreads a lot faster than the good news stories that places they have worked well.
Yeah, I think it's important, if you are taking on a project, to really investigate it well. Talk to, I know there's one parish that's looking at a project. I'm not going to say who they are or what they're doing, but there's people in the what I would call environmental activist community. There's organizations that focus on different aspects of this, not from a church perspective, strictly from an environmental perspective by people who care about the environment. And they've got a lot of expertise out there. And I would be happy to connect people if they're looking at some particular project, to connect you with someone who's got some, or an organization that's got a bit of expertise on that. I think talking to your municipality is really important. There may be ways that you can work together with them on projects, or that they could help you in some way. Some municipalities have a climate change person on staff who can be a great resource for ways that you can use your building and stuff like that. So, but getting back to the earlier part of what I was saying, we need to start talking about this a lot, so that it, and educating ourselves so it becomes a genuinely deeply held value. Everything good will come out of that, but it has to be part of who we are. Like I always say, that we have to live the thing, right? It has to be part of who we are.
And I think it's good also in, kind of major project type things, for the matter to be gazed upon and analyzed through several lenses, not only the financial one, but also the environmental one and theological considerations as well. That, the several lenses can put on the same matter can really show how connected all of these matters are, and that whichever way you turn it, you might likely come to the same conclusion. And that can be very helpful, I think, and very informative, and in many ways inspiring to people at all levels.
Yeah. So I guess, like, if there's no further questions or comments, just point out that the next session in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at creation care as a personal calling, what we as individual followers of Christ can do and should do in faithfully living the fifth. Because I do believe that there's things that I personally, or you personally, can do that a faith community or even a diocese cannot take on. So there is a role for us as individual followers of Christ too, and that will be my focus in the next session.
Mark, some very interesting sessions. I'll be putting out our newsletter before the end of this week and highlighting the links to the last session and this one, and noting that in this time of slowdown for people, it's a great chance to kind of do their own bit of digging and allow it to be a time of kind of retreat in ways. And this is a good area of reflection and ponderance for a lot of reasons. And see our connection to the earth and to one another. And so these teams are excellent for that, and I'll be highlighting them for all who get our newsletter and those who are on our distribution list. Thanks, Mark. Mark, blessings on you until we meet again 2 weeks from this.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.